So I was just asking, you said it's always been there. And I was asking, is that the same for the link specifically to mental health context? So you said, you've had this interest before you came in to mental health and social context, and feeling like some of the ways mental health work was happening weren't helpful. So was that also just always there, always a part of your thinking?
No, so that's a really interesting thing for me to think about, I suppose. I can't think of how it came in, but I remember, I can't remember how I got into reading about critical psychiatry and critical approaches to mental health. I don't know why I got into that. I sometimes used to just read things that were a bit, I suppose, connected to these interests that we had as a family, but perhaps maybe were unusual for somebody of that age to read. So maybe that's how I got into it, I don't know. But I was reading a lot of stuff on kind of critical mental health. And this was when that's probably why I was doing my psychology degree. So I would have been sort of late teens, early 20s. And I think that's probably how I came into being interested in, I maybe came across some statistics about racially minoritized people and mental health, and the way in which it's, it highlights the oppressive nature of the system. And maybe I think I got interested in that and started reading about sort of critical approaches to mental health and critical psychiatry. And although I remember it being quite early on in my training, so I don't know. But anyway, and I remember reading a book called Aliens and Alienists by Maurice Lipsedge and Ronald Wood, I think they were. And it's all about African Caribbean people in the mental health system, and all the statistics that we were kind of aware of now, and kind of critiquing the mainstream psychiatry approach to mental health in relation to race and experiences of racism. And I found it really interesting, and I remember wanting to find out a bit more. At the back of this book, I saw that Maurice Lipsedge was a psychiatrist in a South London hospital that was close to where I was living. I grew up in South London, and I thought, oh well, I'm going to go and interview him. So I found out what ward he was working on and phoned the ward and said, can I arrange to interview Dr. Maurice Lipsedge? And that was all arranged. That happened. I did the interview, and again, it's interesting because he said, oh, that was a very challenging interview. And he said, oh, would you like to come around and talk to some people on the ward, the patients, he called them. And I remember at the time being taken aback by that. I didn't, it probably sounds like quite a confident thing to do, but I certainly didn't feel like a confident person, and probably not until my 30s, even 40s, and even now wouldn't necessarily say I am a confident person. But it was more a sort of, the drive wasn't coming from confidence as such, it was coming from somewhere else. So even when he said that was a challenging interview, I didn't, my aim wasn't to try and be challenging or to kind of, it was, I genuinely had kind of questions about mental health and about power and anyway, so at the end of that, I went around and spoke to people on the ward and with Dr. Lipsedge, and then as we were walking out, as I was going back home, he said, oh, have you thought about becoming a clinical psychologist? I think you'd make a good one. And I hadn't thought about it, didn't know what it was, hadn't heard of them, but went away and researched about what that was. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a clinical psychologist because I thought, well, I don't know if I want to work in a system like that. And then I found critical psychology and thought, oh, that would be good if I could work in that way. And I found a course, University of East London, that at the time was the kind of main place to train in that way, to train kind of critically. And so I was very kind of clear from the beginning that I wanted to I wanted to go in as a critical person and not to train to be a psychologist. So in a way, I think the reading I'd been doing in my undergraduate degree course was the place where I was really putting together some of the things I was experiencing in my life. You know, the relationship between being marginalized and how that impacts on you as an individual and as a group and collectively. So I think, so I went into the profession and I did my systemic training 2 years after qualifying as a psychologist. So, but even before that, I didn't know this at the time, but my parents, but I wonder again if there was this something that was happening in a non explicit way. I think there was actually in my parents and how they brought us up. But years later, my parents told me a story about they were part of a lot of kind of groups that were about kind of unity and coming together and kind of, I suppose, activism in a kind of way. And one of them was called the Progressive Circle, and it was there were Nigerian people that come from Nigeria, and they kind of came together and they had these regular meetings about various different issues, kind of on a local level, kind of global level, and supported each other, and we all went on holiday together and to the seaside together and that kind of thing. And my parents told me that the reason this Progressive Circle started was because one of their friends was very lonely and isolated, and it was very, very racist and a very harsh and hard place to be. And he didn't have people around him, or he missed the people he'd left behind, and he ended up committing suicide. And then as a result of that, they formed this group, the Progressive Circle. So in a way, I guess I think about that because even though it wasn't a story I explicitly remember hearing earlier on in my life, the fact that that was a big part of my life, the Progressive Circle, the meetings they had, the trips out, and the fact that it came from the experience of somebody who, who embodied the connection and link between oppression and mental health. And that there was a kind of community response to that, and the community response to that was unity and togetherness and support. There was something about that even though it was explicitly told to us, I think I experienced in another way, on another level, and that became how, because all of us are very similar in how we are and in the professions that we've gone into, but also the particular approach we take to what we do. It's the same, and that can't be a coincidence, I don't think. But yeah, so I imagine there's something about that we all absorbed in some way.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So all of you have gone into this kind of work in different ways.
Yeah, or have, like, well, for example, like my older sister is a child psychotherapist. She first trained as an educational psychologist, but even her approach to child psychotherapy is critical, and it's I suppose it's different to mainstream child psychotherapy, and she, there's a lot of thinking about power and context and racism and naming it both within the context of the frame that she's trained in, but also the way in which her frame can be used usefully to understand and think about racism. So yeah, so that's, my other sister, my twin sisters is also a systemic therapist. My other sister is, she works in health equalities, but she's a kind of, her role is to support organisations to think about institutional forms of oppression, not just racism, all different forms of oppression, and again, kind of and supporting kind of activists within health kind of context. And my brother is an electronic engineer, so no kind of connection at all, but it just as a person also has that kind of frame in the world, and as a, you know, who he is in the world as a person. So yes, I do think it's something that was never explicitly talked about, but I think it was just how we there were maybe subtle ways in which we were brought up to be like that without it, being explicit, I suppose.
I will say that the article you wrote with your sister about psychoanalysis and
yes,
it really touched me. I have to say, it's one of the only times as a Jewish person reading sort of writing about Jewish kind of people within the psychological field that I felt really seen. And it was actually kind of a real moment for me of, oh, it's possible. It's possible for people to, you can still be critical, you can still question, but to engage with these people, recognizing their context, recognizing who they are, seeing them as Jews and what that meant and means. So it was it's a beautiful conversation, that one that you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for saying that, and thanks for naming that as well. And I think that was something else that I felt was a very big part of my upbringing. So although we were very Afrocentric and very connected to, you know, the Black experience, for want of a better word, and Black people's experiences, we were also, it was never a kind of singular focus. And if anything, there was, I don't know exactly where this came from, but I've always felt this sense of, because we are a global community and family, that in a sense, I feel like it sounds very like the sort of thing you say, but it comes from a very genuine place. I genuinely feel that I was brought up to feel as though that all of our struggles are collective struggles and connected, but very different. And it's important to recognize and understand those differences, but that they are connected, and that and that's a very important part of the process of challenging oppression. And that if you're only ever singular in your approach to challenging oppression, you're never really challenging oppression, and you're never really getting anywhere. And it's something about wanting there to be, you know, how do you open up more and more spaces of empowerment and then enabling people to be able to be for more and more people. That is the process, in a sense. So I was, you know, to being interested in different people's experiences. So I was really interested in the experience of a Jewish community, and the experience of Irish people and their experience of oppression, and I was interested in people from the LGBTQ community. I was interested in disability rights, and you know, and it felt very natural to be interested in different people's experiences of oppression, but also the different things that we learn from each other, and in how people have creatively resisted their experiences. So I think, in a way, resistance has been a really important part of my socialization, because I think for me it is very inclusive, because it is a kind of universal story, and it's a potentially, I think, a really powerful, it can be very overwhelming and painful, but very beautiful story of how we connect to our humanity, and how by seeing the ways in which people insist on the world humanizing them, and how that I always find that very moving. And the different ways that shows up in different stories, I think, is really powerful. And when I've really looked into that, because I'm really, really drawn to that kind of idea of how can different movements of different struggles connect in a way that enhances the process for everybody. And when I've looked into it, I've found it so inspiring. And there's always been these links and connections. So, you know, I can't remember it all now because I find it hard to hold information, but, you know, that the link between what was happening in India against the British Empire, and how that then connected to what was happening in America with the civil rights movement, because, you know, Martin Luther King learned from Mahatma Gandhi, but then there was also Che Guevara in there, and he was also connecting with different people and sharing ideas and you know, and an awful lot of in terms of talking about the Jewish community, my understanding from what I've read as well in America particularly was that most of the white people that were really talking about and challenging racism did come from the Jewish community. There was a real sense of kind of connection and unity there, and I think probably because there is this kind of understanding of, you know, what happens when racism as a violence goes unchecked, and so there's lots of kind of stories of learning from and connection with. There's a really beautiful picture of Martin Luther King during the walk in Selma, and to see the people he was walking with, it's you know, it's remarkable and really moving. And so I think for me, resistance is a story of multiplicity, and I think there's so much more we can do with that in our work. And I'm talking more, maybe it feels quite abstract, but it feels very connected to me to personal experience, my personal life, personal relationships, and the work. In how can we use that idea in the work that we do with groups of people who are harmed or experiencing oppression, or within our structures of oppression, by drawing on the power of solidarity, actually, as a way of working against the structures of oppression that are about disconnecting us, severing the relationship between power and distress, but also severing the relationships between our struggles is part of the strategy of oppression, I think. So narrative practices where they are about writing to and learning from, I love all that kind of stuff. I think it's really powerful, and I'd love to extend that thinking more in the field as well, how we can really draw on those kinds of ideas of bringing different groups of people together and talking about these issues from the point of view of learning from each other, rather than this kind of competitive hierarchy of oppression that doesn't really exist. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, sorry.
I feel like I could follow your tangents all day, and I would like to know so much more about everything that you've talked about, but I do want us to get to the work and what it looks like in practice. Because and I was also just noticing, you kind of said with that psychiatrist, the doctor that you spoke to, that he called them patients and you called them people. What language do you use to talk about people that you work with?
Oh, I don't know, to be honest. I don't, and I'm sure I don't use the right words either. I'm not sure quite know, because I mean, clients is what I tend to use, but I'm not sure how I
always feel right.
Feel about clients, although that's the term I'm most versed in. It's the term I'm most versed in using, but I sometimes feel a bit like, oh, that sounds very kind of capitalist, isn't it? But anyway, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, people we work with.
Yeah, I'll go with clients or people we work with.
Yes.
For now. So in the work, how do you talk about power and resistance? How does it come up?
I don't know if I do talk about it. Not that I don't talk about it, but I mean, what I'm saying is, I'm not sure. I think I could do better in bringing it up, actually, in that I've worked over the years to be more. I'm not a very directive type of. I'm not very directive in my approach, which I think has its merits, but I think has its limitations as well. And I'm trying to be more actively bringing into spaces issues. I think what I am good at is I assume it's already there and I listen out for it, because I think clients are talking about it all the time. So when people say things like, well, but my clients don't talk about racism, or we talk about racism, they say it's not an issue. I talk about the context of what does it mean to talk about racism, how hard is it to talk about, and what does it mean as a black person to talk to a white skinned person about racism, and what's happened to me and how do I feel, and how it's taken me years to feel able to talk explicitly about my experience in a way that even is slightly more authentic than it has been, but not fully authentic. So I think about it more in terms of process, but I always think it's there. And I think maybe because I assume it's there, I create space for it to come out, as opposed to, I'm not always so good at explicitly saying, let's talk about racism, for example, which I think should happen more. I certainly try to encourage other people to do that more. So I should probably be walking the walk a bit more. But that doesn't in any way mean that I'm not having conversations about power and oppression, because I'm having them all the time. So I do think that it's very close to the surface, actually, but often I find that I'm talking explicitly more and more now, but I'm still trying to find, I'm almost still kind of using my senses, how much can I say here? What kind of things can I say? And how do I name it? Do I talk about whiteness? Do I talk about white supremacy, white privilege? Do I talk about institutional racism? Do I use those terms? I am now, but only maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, I probably wasn't. And even now, I'm maybe saying it, but then qualifying what I mean and really giving context to what I'm trying to say, because of how I'm used to it landing. So I because I'm experiencing that, I imagine that people we work with are also doing that. They're listening out for what would be an indication from you that I can go there. What would be an indication from you that you expecting this from me, that you're expecting this as an important part of the conversation. And I feel as though I'm somehow creating a context for, by giving the, I don't know, signals or something that, I don't know if that sounds wishy-washy.
Yeah, I was just saying,
I think it's really
wishy-washy, but do you have an idea of what you do that you said creating the space where it can come up. So do you have an idea of what you do, what signals you are giving, how you communicate that? What is it that creates the space, in addition to the belief that it's happening, that that it's
yeah there? I think maybe it's something about two things. Maybe something about talking explicitly about me. So saying I am a black woman, I am working class, I am Nigerian, British born, and I think maybe it's almost like I'm comfortable saying those things, and therefore I'm maybe communicating that I am assuming you are a person that is multi-layered in these different ways as well, and that the different layers of your experience that you might foreground as important to you may, that you may want to bring that into the conversation, but it's there even if you don't. That maybe something about that. And also sometimes I'm quite visual, so I quite like, as part of warming the context, to write things down and map things out. So I might write the graces, for example, and say, here are kind of issues that I kind of assume are always around and impacting on how I see things, how you might see things, my experience, your experience, between you as a system, in the space. So I'm just going to have them here in the room, and I might at times talk to one or two of them, or invite them into the room, or I might ask you, are any of these things that you think might be useful for us to talk about that we haven't talked about so far? Or I might suggest something that we haven't talked about, and then you can tell me whether you think it's helpful to go there or not. So I think I am quite good at bringing it in if I've warmed the context. I'm not. I think there were other therapists that are very good at just saying, let's talk about. I'm less like that. I think I need to warm the context a bit to talk about things. That's everything. That's not just the graces. That's sex. That's talking about all kinds of other taboos, I feel like I need to kind of warm the space to do that. In a way that other people are much more confident just saying it. Just say it, Taiwo. So would be I can remember my supervisor when I was training saying to me. And the other thing maybe that I do is I like to use the graces alongside something called the action continuum, which I find really helpful. So it's this sort of stage process thing that looks at the different stages of action. Everything from stage 1 is not really acting or reflecting on a particular issue, all the way down to 8, which is reflecting a lot and acting a lot, and everything in between, and the ways in which we move in between, up and down. That I find that quite helpful to also bring into the space, because it's never just a sort of singular linear process talking about a particular social grace or issue of power and oppression. There are certain times it comes in much more freely, and other times it might be more difficult to talk about, or aspects of it that are harder to talk about or easier to talk about. Or there might be other graces in terms of intersectionality that aren't being talked about, or implicitly, people actively feeding into dominant discourses in relation to particular graces. So sometimes that can be helpful to bring in as well, like where on this action continuum do you think you are in relation to this issue, but especially when you're working with like a family, for example, where there might be commonality in relation to one grace, but a difference in relation to another. And I might either do that explicitly by writing it down in terms of stages, or I might just do it in terms of holding it in mind and bringing it into my questions. One way I've done it with working with children in a group is when they've talked about a particular issue, say gender or race, but they have perhaps not been thoughtful about other issues like sexuality or disability, for example, and actually drawing on sort of negative or oppressive discourses in relation to those other issues. Then I've sometimes got them into a line, like physically into a line, and we have talked about different positions. What does it mean to, well, some people, young people might be talking about actively challenging discourses of oppression. So what I might ask them, what might you call that if we were doing that? And if you stood there and that's the position that you would call that, and what's the opposite position and what might we call that? And so where would you place yourself in this, between those just different points in relation to what's happening here in the moment? So this is idea that it's a fluid thing and it's movement, it's not a fixed position, and it might be something that's happening in the moment, and trying to get people to think about how does what you're saying just now fit into this process of challenging oppression in relation to that issue, or upholding kind of ideas that might be experienced as harmful, oppressive to people. So I kind of use visual tools to encourage the conversation, or to allow it. I think that's what I think about. I think about it more in terms of allowing rather than encouraging, as opposed to explicitly. I do sometimes explicitly bring it in, but that's not the kind of main way that I tend to work.
And what about resistance specifically?
I think resistance for me is I find it much easier, because I think it's always there. I feel like it's always being shown, but maybe there's something about how other people might story it in a way. And it's interesting that I know maybe something for me to think about, why I might feel more comfortable naming resistance and wanting other people to name power for themselves. I don't think that's interesting. I need to maybe rethink that and question myself around that, and maybe swap that around a bit, or play around with that a bit. But maybe it's something about where I feel anyway, maybe it's my personal story, that I had less exposure to people seeing my resistance and reflecting it back at me, and that I found that a very powerful experience. So I think I feel much more, maybe I feel more emotionally invested in that process, in that I think I'm always seeing it, how people respond and resist harm. But it's often not framed that way. It might be framed as, well, Alan Wade talks about it, so he talked about it, but, you know, symptoms of some kind, you know, school refusal or depression or self-harm or aggression or disruptive behavior, or like even the kind of music people listen to, and actually understanding that they are responses to something else that directs our attention somewhere else, I think often gets hidden under these labels that we use. But if we do see them as forms of resistance, then what are they resistance towards? And that's where I think sometimes having that kind of conversation about understanding the values behind what is in someone's responses or behavior and the context that it happens in, and then coming to a narrative around this being a kind of resistance. I mean, I won't necessarily use that word. I think I use the words that make sense to people. But even just talking about it in that way, this is in response to this. So it sounds like you are, that this action is a way of addressing this issue, or a way of rejecting this situation, or a way of opting out of this option that you've been given. Or something else, something along those lines. But yeah, that feels much more, feels so much easier for me in some ways. I think once you start seeing the world in that way, it's very hard not to see the world in that way. And it's, yeah.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, are there kind of particular words or phrases or questions that you use or draw on in that restorying? But you've started to answer it with saying, you know, is that action in response to, or it seems like that behavior is a way of rejecting that. So I can hear that sort of construction in a way of just seeing those two things in relationship and making that explicit. Are there other ways that you do that restorying?
I think that I like to draw on what people actually say, but there's something about, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because we can say something and different people hear different things, and if I relay back what I'm hearing, then it leads to people then being able to express the resistance within it because of what. So, for example, if someone says, you know, my school is really, I hate my school, and you know, they don't help me. They don't help me to learn. I'm always being sent out of a classroom, and yet I'm somehow supposed to catch up with the learning. No one really helps me with the fact that I'm not finding it easy to learn. Nobody appreciates that I'm much better in sport, and I'm really great in sport, and I'm constantly being, you know, problematized, or constantly being seen as a problem, and I'm just sick of it, and that's why I'm not going to school. And I suppose if what I'm hearing is, and I might ask permission, is it okay to share what I'm hearing you say? And then in that I might convey what I'm hearing, which is, it sounds like you're saying something about how harmful or oppressive or difficult or challenging or unhelpful the school system feels to you, and you've decided you're no longer going to put yourself in that situation anymore. Is that kind of what you're saying? And then people have a conversation about that. because then it's, you know, it's not I'm just doing a bad thing and being a bad young person. It's saying something about an active response to something. And then you can ask questions about, what does that say about you? What are you valuing that you're trying to hold on to, or that you are trying to, or what you're trying to convey and communicate? Or what are you trying to honor in yourself? If it's, you know, it's too exhausting mentally to be in a classroom, or you're constantly being put into a position where you are othered or problematized, and that really is damaging to your self-esteem, to take yourself out of that suggests that you're trying to protect your self-esteem, protect your sense of who you are. And then what tends to happen is then you find out, well, what else are you doing? Well, I'm out playing football. I'm being my best self. I'm fantastic at football. And then that's in itself is, again, a very different story, isn't it? Of, as opposed to they're just bunking off school and playing football with their friends, and it's because they're lazy. And yeah, I think because I hear creative forms of resistance, it's easier to have that conversation because I feel like people are saying it, and they don't often feel that people are seeing it in them.
Because of time, I'm going to ask you like 3 questions all at once, and then you can the most relevant bit to answer. So I'm curious if the work you're doing, sort of honoring resistance in these ways, is it the same when you're in a family context, or how is it different when you're working with a family rather than an individual? And that's partly because I've heard examples from sort of group work and community work and individual, but I'm interested also in that sort of family therapy context. On top of that, if there's any changes that happen with families open to social care. And particularly something that I've found difficult is when I see sort of resistance in the moment. So you might see a parent sort of say something derogatory to a child, and you see the child sort of resist and not accept that story about themselves in the moment, and how you deal with that sort of in the detail of you're in that moment with a family.
Yeah. I think, and again, you know, it's tricky, isn't it, when you say things, because it sounds like maybe because you're saying it in that moment, that's what you think is always the case and how it should be. And the moment I've said something, I've moved on a bit from what I've said, kind of thing, or it might shift and change at different times and different moments. But I think my general sense is that, particularly in a family context, I think my approach is to tend to try and take it out of the family. I think there's maybe a danger of, for example, the example that you gave, to then see the young person's resistance to the parent as being, well, therefore the parent's the oppressor. And I'm not suggesting that that isn't sometimes the experience for the young person, or even sometimes how we might even view what's happening. But I guess because of maybe my own personal values or experience or frame, that I'm always trying to think about what's happening to the system of the family, and how is that getting played out in the bodies of the people within the family, and how the different people within the system feeling oppression, and how's that being expressed. And that might also get into their relationships in terms of how they then might become literally experienced by the other as the oppressor, or thinks of self as being oppressed. But the complexity of how that might go both ways, but also the complexity of how oppression impacts on the family. So, for example, if a parent's being derogatory towards a child, I'm curious about where that comes from. I'm always assuming it comes from something else. So is it about the parent feeling overwhelmed because they are isolated, and they're struggling, and they don't know what to do, and they feel they've tried everything, and they're scared for their child, and they feel bad about themselves as a parent, and it comes out in this very negative story about the child. They just won't. They are just this. They're in that kind of way, and understandably and rightly, the young person resists that way of framing them and fixing them in that story, as though because the parent isn't involving themselves in that context, or or able to see themselves and how they're part of the child's experience and what the child is, how the child's behaving. So I might be interested in that interaction, but I'm in a way also interested in what is the wider context kind of feeding into those positions in the family, and how might we talk about what's happening in the family, but also what's happening around the family, and what might be the other positions that could be taken if some of those outside pressures were tackled and looked at. So, I talked a lot with families about the kind of invisible kind of gaze that can be very shaping of how people behave in the family. That people that aren't physically in your space, in your room, in your life, but just being aware of them can be very shaping of how you do things. A kind of what if, or if you keep on behaving this way, this will happen, or if they could see this, or what might they think about me as a parent, and what kind of world are you going into? Particularly when I think of the high proportion of people from racially minoritized communities that are in the care system and who are kind of coming into the social care system and working with social workers. I just can't help but think about it in the context of racial trauma and how that is such a powerful context to parenting and the task of parenting. What does it mean to bring up a child into a world where there's pervasive harm that is traumatic? And how does that shape your priorities? How does it shape your anxieties and concerns and expectations and challenges? So in a sense, power and resistance, I think, definitely within the relationships within the family, but really trying to humanize the people in the family by looking at, what are they struggling with actually, but also what they're collectively struggling with, but also not watering down their individual struggles, because they're different. The child's experience within that is very different to the parent, and they have very unique challenges by virtue of being young, having less power, having less voice, having a different context. The context of their lives are very different, their peer group, their community experience, the systems they go through are very different to what the parent is experiencing, but likewise the parent's context and systems are very, very different from what the child is experiencing. So how to also talk about within the general experience of the invisible gaze, or the kind of harmful context that families are existing within, impacting on the family. How do we then talk about how each individual family member experiences that? What are the unique things that they're trying to navigate? And sometimes I've done that by taking an individual and mapping out with them while the other members of the family listen and watch, and listen out for things they perhaps weren't so aware of. But what are your contexts? What are the explicit or implicit rules within those contexts? What are the expectations? What are the messages that are there that you're having to navigate? And that's often a real eye-opener for parents, because they're not necessarily aware of all the things that the ways in which their children are behaving is often because of all these different things they're trying to navigate. But similarly, the children may not be aware of what the parents are having to sort of navigate. That doesn't get into the conversation. So that can be, I think, really helpful to try and help each member of the family to really reflect on and think about the other, but at a point where it feels that they want to do that. I don't like to assume that they're at a point where they want to be thinking about their parents' context, or that parents can even see or even take it in their children's context if there are other stuff that feels pressing for them. But that's, I think, the kind of approach might try and take by taking it out of the family and not sort of staying. I think because for me, there's so much emphasis on the behaviours of those in the family, and I don't know how helpful it is, like parenting programs and trying to get parents to, I feel like it has its limitations because we're not really addressing the wider issues that yeah. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
No, it's really helpful. I can hear the influence of CMM as well in sort of
yes, yeah, absolutely.
widening and what are the rules, what's the logic here?
Yeah,
those different contexts. How's it been having this conversation?
I've really enjoyed it. It's really there's lots of things I'm thinking about as I'm talking. I'm thinking, oh gosh, why don't I explicitly? Why I'm all kind of like direct when I'm talking about, and is that an expectation of me as well? Am I saying something that people might be like, oh, that's a bit, doesn't seem very coherent with your approach, Taiwo? I don't know, but it's been really, really interesting and really useful, but particularly because I'm listening to myself, and it's making me reflect on myself. Actually, reflect on what is the kind of way that I tend to be in the room with people, and what do I find more comfortable, what do I find more challenging, how am I working with that, and how is it all coming into the space, and in a way that's responsive and centered by the people you're working with. So yeah, it's been really interesting and useful to reflect on some things that I'm thinking about, that I want to continue to be curious about in myself.
I found it really interesting, that observation you had, that it's easier to name or talk about resistance kind of more directly than it is about oppression. And I wonder if there's an almost solution focused, it's something in that of like, let's talk about what you're doing well, or what's strength, or sort of amplify, what do we amplify, what do we pay attention to, what do we water to make it grow, and what that does, that sort of awareness of the resistance, which is in relation to power. So naming resistance, you can't help but name what it's in relationship to. But that as a way in.
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe there's something as well about that it still feels, even though I think it's so important, it still feels very tricky and challenging to name oppression in our society. And even at a point in time where it feels like, maybe for some people it feels like that's all we talk about, but for me, I don't experience it like that. I feel like there's this huge big there's so much that's unsaid, I think, already. I feel the weight of the unsaid so much in terms of actually naming experiences, and using language of power within that explicitly, that actually explicitly positions people in relation to systems of power, but how we are invited into holding them. I think that can be really hard to explicitly name. So when you're talking about racism, when you're talking about sexism or misogyny or homophobia, you're explicitly naming how we are invited into holding those systems. And I find it brings up so much that maybe I've felt in my own personal experience has been really challenging and difficult, but very necessary. Whereas somehow talking about resistance feels so much more enabling, and this feels like a kind of opening up. And in fact, more recently, I've been talking about trying to use that same language when I talk about power. I invite people, before I even go into talking about racial trauma, for example, I talk about, can we go into the body, and can we go into a space that's the center of yourself? And can you just notice what's there, and notice all the difficult things that might arise, and just imagine the expansion around it? Because I feel so much of this kind of tightening, closing down, defensiveness, either physically or verbally, people sort of saying, you know, things that are shutting down and dismissive or rubbishing or competitive or comparisons or whatever it might be. It's constant this sort of feeling, and I'm trying to get to a point where I'm suggesting, can there be kind of an opening, a different kind of approach, even if it's met with difficult feelings of having to really think about how we are all feeding into and playing into these systems and part of the problem. Was I naturally feel that when I talk about resistance, is a natural kind of like opening. So I think, yeah, something a bit about that as well for me, but I'd really like to think about that a bit more. And it's interesting because not everybody would say that about resistance. Some people would think of resistance as something quite negative and frightening and scary, and so that's obviously my particular relationship to that word. I even use the word disruption. I like the word disruption. You know, just this morning I was doing some teaching, and we talked about the importance of confronting things. So even though they've been confrontational, again, that's often thought of as negative. I was saying, what's wrong with being confronting things? So these are all, you know, it's the things that I value those kinds of terms. So that other people might find them hard, but I feel like they are, yeah, there's an opening around them that I like.
Thank you so much, Taiwo.
I feel like I've just waffled on now.
No, I would love to get out. I know that you have an appointment now, so
yes, I do.
But thank you so much, and I'll be in touch again with some little follow-ups.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me to taking part in this interview, and yeah, and your really interesting, thought-provoking questions.
All right.
Thank you. Have a good day.